He spent $73 million of his own money trying to buy the presidency in 1960s dollars, when that sum could purchase entire corporations. 4 times he ran, 4 times he lost. But along the way, Nelson Rockefeller transformed an entire state, built architectural monuments that still dominate skylines, and wielded more power than most elected presidents ever dreamed of. The grandson of America's first billionaire didn't just enter politics. He redefined what money could accomplish in democratic government. He built universities from scratch, carved highways through mountains, and reshaped New York's physical landscape with the ambition that bordered on megalomania. The bill? Over $6 billion in state debt that taxpayers would spend decades repaying. The numbers sound fictional. As governor of New York, he created 75 new state agencies. He built the largest state university system in America, 64 campuses educating 400,000 students. He demolished entire neighborhoods to construct the World Trade Center and Lincoln Center. He spent more on infrastructure in 15 years than New York had spent in the previous century. But here's what nobody talks about. While Rockefeller was rebuilding New York into a progressive showcase, he ordered state police to storm Attica Prison, resulting in 43 deaths. While he championed civil rights publicly, he built housing projects that concentrated poverty. While he preached fiscal responsibility, he invented financial schemes to hide billions in debt from voters. This wasn't normal politics. This was a billionaire treating an entire state as his personal construction project. His family fortune gave him advantages no rival could match. He hired the best political minds money could buy. He commissioned polls that cost more than his opponents' entire campaigns. He owned art collections worth hundreds of millions. He married a woman 18 years younger, while serving a scandal that would have destroyed anyone else. And when he finally reached national power as vice president under Gerald Ford, he discovered something that money couldn't buy: respect from a president who viewed him as a political liability rather than a governing partner. This is the story of Nelson Rockefeller, the man who proved that in American politics, inherited billions can build empires, but can't guarantee love, respect, or the ultimate prize he spent his entire life pursuing. The boy who would spend billions of public money grew up in private wealth so extreme it created its own gravitational field. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller's childhood home at Pocantico Hills offered 3,400 acres of carefully manicured grounds, complete with private roads, golf course, indoor tennis court, and views across the Hudson River that money literally couldn't buy. Because the Rockefellers owned the entire viewshed, the family employed 60 full-time staff just to maintain the grounds. But John D. Rockefeller Jr., Nelson's father, was determined that his children not become idle rich wastrels. Every Saturday morning, the Rockefeller children lined up to receive their allowances, a few dollars at most, and were required to record every expenditure in detailed account books subject to parental review. Nelson got 25 cents a week as a young child. He was expected to tithe 10% to church, save another portion, and account for every remaining cent. If he wanted to buy something beyond his allowance, he needed to earn money through extra chores, weeding gardens, cleaning, helping with maintenance. This absurd juxtaposition, living in a mansion with priceless art while carefully budgeting quarters, was deliberate. John Jr. was trying to instill values that his own father, the ruthless monopolist, had lacked. The senior Rockefeller had built Standard Oil through practices so predatory that Congress eventually broke up the company as an illegal trust. That legacy haunted John Jr., who spent his life trying to transform Rockefeller from a synonym for greed into a name associated with public service. Nelson absorbed this mission with characteristic intensity. Unlike his shy older brother John III or his intellectual younger brother David, Nelson was energetic, outgoing, and aggressively ambitious. He wanted to do big things, to leave his mark, to matter. You see, growing up in the shadow of American history's greatest fortune creates a peculiar psychology. Nelson would never need to work a day in his life, but that very freedom made his choices more significant. What would he do with unlimited resources and a famous name? His mother, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, provided crucial influence. She was artistic, cultured, and socially progressive, much more than her conservative Baptist husband. Abby collected modern art when it was still scandalous, supported civil rights when it was controversial, and encouraged her children to think broadly about their place in the world, Nelson inherited her aesthetic sensibility and progressive instincts. He loved art, architecture, and visual grandeur. He also absorbed her belief that the wealthy had obligations to society that transcended mere charity. They should actively reshape social institutions to create a better world. At the Lincoln School in Manhattan, an experimental private school based on progressive educational theories, Nelson proved an indifferent student academically, but a natural leader socially. He organized classmates, led projects, and demonstrated the kind of managerial energy that would later define his political career. His dyslexia, undiagnosed at the time, made traditional academics a struggle. He compensated by developing extraordinary memory, social intelligence, and an ability to synthesize information visually rather than through written text. These compensations would serve him well in politics, where personal connection often matters more than policy mastery. Here's what's interesting. Nelson's childhood prepared him perfectly for building institutions, and terribly for understanding people outside his class. He learned to think big, to deploy resources aggressively, to pursue ambitious visions. But he never learned what it felt like to worry about money, to face a problem that couldn't be solved through hiring experts, or to navigate the constraints that limit normal people's choices. At Dartmouth College, which Nelson entered in 1926, this privileged confidence manifested clearly. He was a mediocre student, graduating in the bottom third of his class, but a brilliant socializer. He joined the right fraternities, knew everyone worth knowing, and spent summers traveling the world. During one college summer, Nelson traveled to Venezuela to assess oil properties for the family. This trip gave him exposure to Latin America that would later become his initial area of expertise. He saw poverty on a scale that shocked him, colonial exploitation that offended his progressive instincts, and opportunities where Rockefeller money could make a difference. The Venezuela experience planted seeds for his later role as coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. Nelson came to believe that Latin America represented both a strategic concern for the United States, particularly as Nazi influence grew in the 1930s, and a moral challenge requiring American engagement. After graduating from Dartmouth in 1930, Nelson married Mary Todhunter Clark, a childhood friend from another wealthy family. The marriage was respectable, conventional, and ultimately unfulfilling for both parties. They would remain married for 32 years, producing 5 children, while Nelson pursued serial affairs and Mary retreated into quiet desperation. The marriage revealed something important about Nelson. He could compartmentalize ruthlessly. Public image demanded a stable family, so he maintained the appearance. Personal satisfaction came elsewhere. This ability to separate spheres, to present one face while living another, would serve him throughout his political career. His first real job came in 1931, when his father assigned him to oversee rental operations at Rockefeller Center, the massive commercial complex being built in Midtown Manhattan. This wasn't a normal entry-level position. Nelson was essentially apprenticing as a master builder, learning to manage contractors, negotiate with unions, deal with architects, and push through an ambitious construction project during the Depression. Rockefeller Center was the family's largest single project, a $125 million investment at the height of economic collapse. Critics called it folly. Who would rent office space when businesses were failing nationwide? But John Jr. pressed forward, partly as a stimulus to create jobs, partly as a monument to family vision. Nelson loved every aspect of the work. He thrived on the complexity, the deal-making, the daily problem-solving. He discovered that he had a talent for organization and a taste for large-scale projects. Where others saw overwhelming complexity, he saw exciting challenges. Look at what this experience taught him: that grand visions require ignoring critics, that big projects create their own political support through jobs and economic activity, and that monuments to family legacy can be disguised as public service. These lessons would define his governorship. When critics later accused him of building unnecessarily grand state buildings, he would point to Rockefeller Center and argue that quality architecture serves the public long after construction costs are forgotten. When opponents attacked his borrowing schemes, he would argue that economic stimulus through construction justifies temporary debt. By the mid-1930s, Nelson had developed a reputation within the family as the ambitious son, the builder, the one who wanted more than philanthropy or banking. His brothers were settling into traditional Rockefeller roles: John III in the family foundations, David preparing for banking, Lawrence investing in aviation and venture capital. Nelson wanted power. Not the quiet power of foundation boards or corporate directorships. Real power, the kind that moves millions of people, shapes landscapes, changes history. In 1935, he joined the board of Creole Petroleum, a Standard Oil subsidiary operating in Venezuela. This position combined family business interests with his growing Latin American expertise. He traveled frequently to Venezuela, observing the intersection of oil wealth, political corruption, and massive poverty. What struck Nelson most was the visible impact of American corporate practices on Latin American societies. He saw company towns where workers lived in squalor, while executives enjoyed luxury. He witnessed the resentment this inequality generated, and he concluded that American companies needed to adopt more progressive practices, better housing, schools, medical care for workers, both for moral reasons and to combat communist influence. This progressive capitalism, using corporate resources to create social benefits while maintaining capitalist structures, became a hallmark of Nelson's political philosophy. He genuinely believed that enlightened elites could solve social problems more effectively than either pure free markets or socialist planning. By 1940, with war spreading across Europe and Nazi influence growing in Latin America, Nelson saw an opportunity to translate his Venezuela experience into national service. He lobbied the Roosevelt administration to create a new agency focused on Latin American affairs. Roosevelt, always politically astute, recognized multiple benefits in appointing Nelson Rockefeller to such a role. It would bring Republican support to his administration, tap into Rockefeller expertise and connections, and signal American commitment to the Western Hemisphere. In August 1940, Roosevelt created the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs and appointed 32-year-old Nelson to run it. This appointment marked Nelson's transition from wealthy heir to governmental power broker. He now controlled an agency with real budget, real staff, and real influence over American foreign policy. And he approached the job with the same energy he brought to Rockefeller Center: hire the best people money could buy, spend aggressively, launch ambitious programs, and worry about the details later. The pattern was set. For the next 39 years, Nelson Rockefeller would pursue power through a combination of inherited wealth, genuine progressive vision, and administrative chaos that somehow produced monuments alongside disasters. Nelson Rockefeller discovered during World War II that he loved the game of government even more than he loved the rewards of power. The Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, which Roosevelt created for him in 1940, became Nelson's first real laboratory for the governing style that would later define his time as New York's governor. He had budget, staff, and a mission vague enough to justify almost anything. The agency's official purpose was countering Nazi influence in Latin America through cultural exchange, economic cooperation, and propaganda. Nelson interpreted this broadly. Within 2 years, he'd built an organization employing 1,100 people with an annual budget of $38 million, enormous for a wartime agency competing for resources. He recruited talented people aggressively, offering salaries far above government standards and raiding other agencies for their best staff. His office produced films, radio programs, and magazines promoting American values. They funded health clinics, agricultural programs, and infrastructure projects across Latin America. They gathered intelligence on Nazi activities and worked with local governments to suppress Axis influence. The programs were often brilliant in conception and chaotic in execution. Nelson would launch initiatives faster than staff could implement them, reorganize departments without warning, and pursue contradictory objectives simultaneously. Subordinates found him inspiring but exhausting. He generated ideas faster than any organization could absorb them. What made Nelson different from typical Washington bureaucrats was his complete immunity to budget constraints. When told a program would cost too much, he'd argue that spending more money now would save more later. When agencies competed for scarce wartime resources, Nelson deployed Rockefeller connections to secure what he needed. Normal governmental limitations simply didn't apply. You see, this experience taught Nelson a dangerous lesson: that sufficient resources and personal drive could overcome almost any obstacle. He never internalized the constraints that shape normal politics: that budgets have limits, that public opinion matters, that democratic processes require patience and compromise. But the war years also revealed Nelson's genuine progressive instincts. He pushed American companies operating in Latin America to improve worker conditions, arguing this was both morally right and strategically necessary. He supported land reform, labor rights, and public health initiatives that horrified conservative business interests. This put him at odds with traditional Republicans, who viewed such policies as socialism, and with many Democrats, who suspected his motives. Nelson was inventing what would later be called Rockefeller republicanism, fiscally aggressive, socially liberal, unapologetically elitist, and convinced that enlightened government could solve social problems. After the war ended in 1945, Nelson continued in government service, briefly serving as Assistant Secretary of State for American Republic Affairs. This position put him in direct contact with the emerging Cold War foreign policy establishment and gave him exposure to high-level diplomatic negotiations. But Nelson found the State Department frustrating. Career diplomats moved too slowly, worried too much about protocol, and lacked the action orientation he valued. After less than a year, he resigned and returned to the family business and philanthropic interests. The late 1940s saw Nelson involved in multiple ventures. He chaired the International Development Advisory Board, advising President Truman on foreign aid programs. He ran Rockefeller Center and family real estate holdings. He served on corporate boards and foundation boards. He collected art with the same aggressive acquisitiveness he brought to everything else. But politics kept calling. By 1950, Nelson had decided his ultimate ambition was the presidency, not the vice presidency or a cabinet post, the top job. He believed his combination of executive experience, family name, progressive vision, and access to unlimited campaign resources made him uniquely qualified. The path to the White House, he concluded, required first winning statewide office to establish a political base independent of his family name. New York's governorship was the obvious target. The state was huge, economically important, and traditionally a launching pad for presidential candidates. Here's what's interesting. Nelson approached politics the way a military commander approaches a campaign. He commissioned extensive polling to identify voter concerns. He hired top political consultants to develop strategy. He studied successful campaigns to learn winning techniques. He prepared himself as thoroughly as unlimited money and obsessive energy allowed. President Eisenhower appointed Nelson Undersecretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in 1953, giving him another stint in Washington. Nelson used this position to push for expanded federal role in education and healthcare, positions that aligned with his progressive instincts but often clashed with Eisenhower's more conservative preferences. I mean, think about the dynamic. Nelson was serving in a Republican administration while advocating policies that many Republicans considered dangerously liberal. He wanted massive federal spending on schools, universal health insurance, aggressive civil rights enforcement. These positions reflected genuine conviction, but also careful political positioning. Nelson was establishing himself as the progressive Republican who could win both moderate voters and party conservatives. By 1955, Nelson had concluded that federal service, while valuable for resume building, wasn't the path to power he craved. Washington required too much compromise, too much deference to congressional leaders and cabinet colleagues. He resigned and began planning his run for governor of New York. The decision to challenge for the governorship in 1958 was both audacious and carefully calculated. The incumbent governor, Averell Harriman, was a fellow aristocrat, heir to a railroad fortune, who'd served in multiple Democratic administrations. Harriman was intelligent, accomplished, and widely expected to win re-election. But Nelson saw vulnerabilities. Harriman was 67 years old and lacked personal warmth. The state was facing economic challenges, and most importantly, no candidate could outspend a Rockefeller. Nelson's 1958 gubernatorial campaign introduced New York voters to a new kind of politics. He spent over $2 million, a staggering sum at the time, on the most sophisticated media campaign the state had ever seen. His advisors conducted extensive polling to identify key issues. They produced television commercials that showcased Nelson's energy and optimism. They organized rallies that felt more like coronations than campaign events. Nelson himself campaigned with manic energy. He visited every county, shook thousands of hands, ate countless rubber chicken dinners. He spoke in Spanish to Puerto Rican audiences in New York City. He promised Jewish voters strong support for Israel. He told upstate farmers he'd protect agricultural interests. He assured New York City residents he'd address urban problems aggressively. The campaign revealed both Nelson's strengths and his fundamental dishonesty. He was a brilliant retail politician, warm, engaging, seemingly genuine in his concern for ordinary people. But his promises were impossibly contradictory. He pledged both increased spending on everything and fiscal responsibility. He promised both urban renewal and preservation of neighborhoods. He claimed he could solve every problem without raising taxes. Look at what he was selling. The idea that a super-competent executive with access to expert knowledge could transcend normal political trade-offs. Vote for Nelson, the message implied, and he'll figure out how to give everyone what they want. Harriman ran a lackluster campaign, underestimating both Nelson's appeal and his willingness to spend whatever it took to win. When Election Day came in November 1958, Nelson won by over 500,000 votes, a stunning victory that immediately established him as a national political figure and potential presidential candidate. His victory speech struck themes that would echo throughout his governorship. We have work to do, great work, building schools, building roads, building the future. The specifics were vague, but the vision was grand. New York would become a laboratory for progressive governance, a model for the nation. What voters didn't realize was that Nelson's vision of building was literal. He intended to physically reconstruct large portions of the state through the most ambitious public works program in American history. The cost would be measured in billions. The debt would burden taxpayers for decades. The monuments would bear his name long after everyone forgot the price. Within weeks of taking office, Nelson began laying groundwork for this transformation. He recruited top administrators from across the country, offering salaries that state government had never paid. He commissioned studies on everything from highway needs to higher education capacity. He began sketching plans for buildings, campuses, and urban renewal projects. The governor's office became organized chaos, constantly buzzing with energy, ideas flowing faster than staff could process them, reorganizations happening without warning. Nelson worked 16-hour days, demanded the same from subordinates, and showed no patience for anyone who questioned whether his grand visions were actually achievable. By the end of his first year as governor, Nelson had proposed legislation creating new state agencies, expanding the university system, and launching highway construction on a scale New York had never attempted. The price tag: hundreds of millions initially, billions eventually. Republicans who thought they'd elected a fiscal conservative watched in horror as Nelson governed like a New Deal Democrat on steroids. Democrats who expected opposition found themselves outflanked on the left by a Republican governor proposing more spending than they dared imagine. And through it all, Nelson radiated absolute confidence that his vision was right, his methods sound, and his legacy assured. The fact that he was risking the state's fiscal future on untested schemes didn't concern him. When you've never faced consequences for failure, you tend not to worry about downside risk. The stage was set for the most consequential governorship in modern New York history, a 15-year run that would transform the state's physical landscape while burying it under debt that would take generations to repay. Nelson Rockefeller didn't just govern New York. He rebuilt it with the ambition that bordered on megalomania. Within his first 2 years as governor, he'd launched construction projects across the state on a scale that dwarfed anything in New York's history. The Empire State Plaza in Albany, the State University of New York expansion, the South Mall complex, miles of new highways, public housing projects in New York City, cultural centers, hospitals, office buildings. The bill would eventually exceed $6 billion, equivalent to over $50 billion today. And that was just the direct costs. The interest on bonds issued to finance construction would add billions more. Here's the thing. Nelson couldn't simply appropriate this money through normal budget processes. That would require legislative approval, which wouldn't come easily and would show up in budget documents where taxpayers could see it. So he invented one of the most creative and legally dubious financing schemes in American political history. The mechanism was called moral obligation bonds, and it worked like this. The state would create supposedly independent public authorities to build and operate facilities. These authorities would issue bonds, backed not by the state's full faith and credit, but by the state's moral obligation to cover any shortfall in debt service. This semantic distinction allowed Nelson to claim the debt wasn't really state debt. keeping it off the official books and avoiding constitutional limits on state borrowing. Brilliant? Yes. Honest? Absolutely not. The Urban Development Corporation, which Nelson created in 1968, became his primary vehicle for this scheme. The UDC had power to override local zoning, issue unlimited bonds, and build anywhere in the state without meaningful oversight. It was essentially a state within a state, answerable only to Nelson, and wielding the power of eminent domain backed by unlimited borrowing capacity. Critics warned that this was fiscal madness, that moral obligation was legal fiction that would eventually force the state to assume billions in debt. Nelson dismissed these concerns with aristocratic contempt. The projects would pay for themselves through rents and fees, he claimed. The economic growth they stimulated would generate tax revenue exceeding their costs. Anyone who couldn't see this was thinking too small. You see, Nelson approached government finance the way he approached personal finance, with complete confidence that money would always be available when needed. He'd never experienced budget constraints personally. The Rockefeller fortune had always provided whatever he wanted. Why should state government be different? The Empire State Plaza in Albany perfectly encapsulated his governing philosophy. The complex, a sprawling collection of towers, plazas, and government buildings occupying 98 acres in downtown Albany, was designed to be New York's answer to Brasilia, the modernist capital of Brazil that had so impressed Nelson during a visit. He commissioned cutting-edge architecture featuring stark modernist towers, acres of marble, and enormous public spaces. The original budget, $250 million, the final cost, over $2 billion, 8 times the initial estimate. Construction required demolishing a historic neighborhood, displacing thousands of residents, and requisitioning property through eminent domain. Local opposition was fierce. Residents whose homes were being demolished protested. Preservationists objected to destroying Albany's historic core. Fiscal conservatives warned the costs would bankrupt the state. Nelson ignored them all, steamrolling forward with absolute certainty that his vision was correct. The Empire State Plaza would take 15 years to complete, eventually becoming a monument to both Nelson's ambition and his fiscal recklessness. The buildings are undeniably impressive, soaring towers of marble and glass that dominate Albany's skyline. But they cost taxpayers billions more than necessary and displaced a vibrant neighborhood to create windswept plazas that feel empty and inhuman. I mean, look at the pattern. Grand vision, overwhelming costs, displacement of ordinary people, and monuments that bear the creator's name forever. This was Rockefeller development in microcosm. The State University of New York expansion represented Nelson's most consequential building program. When he became governor in 1959, SUNY was a modest system of a few campuses serving about 40,000 students. By the time he left office in 1973, SUNY had grown to 64 campuses enrolling over 400,000 students, the largest state university system in America. This expansion addressed a genuine need. Post-war baby boomers were reaching college age, and New York lacked sufficient higher education capacity. But Nelson's approach, building entirely new campuses rather than expanding existing ones, mandating architectural grandeur rather than functional simplicity, and refusing to consider costs, turned necessary expansion into fiscal disaster. Each new SUNY campus required hundreds of millions in construction and created ongoing operational costs that would burden the state budget forever. Nelson sold the program by claiming education was an investment that would pay dividends through higher productivity and tax revenue. These claims were never seriously analyzed. They were simply assertions from a governor who brooked no opposition. The highway construction program followed similar patterns. Nelson built thousands of miles of new highways across New York, connecting cities, opening rural areas to development, and cementing the state's dependence on automobiles. These highways displaced neighborhoods, often poor and minority neighborhoods, and locked in development patterns that would create problems for decades. But they also created thousands of construction jobs, opened new areas to economic development, and modernized infrastructure that genuinely needed updating. This is the paradox of Nelson's governorship. Many of his projects addressed real needs and produced lasting benefits, even as they imposed crushing costs and unnecessary displacement. The housing programs Nelson championed were particularly revealing. He genuinely believed in integrated housing and supported fair housing laws that were progressive for the era. But the public housing projects he built often concentrated poverty rather than alleviating it. The urban renewal programs he funded demolished vibrant neighborhoods and replaced them with soulless towers. Here's what's interesting. Nelson had almost no personal understanding of how poor people actually lived. He'd visited slums, toured housing projects, met with community leaders, but he'd never experienced economic insecurity, never worried about rent, never navigated the indignities of poverty. His solutions reflected this distance. They were what a wealthy architect might design if given unlimited budget and asked to house poor people efficiently. The actual residents of these housing projects had different priorities. They wanted community, neighborhoods with history and character, local control over their environments. Nelson offered them modern towers with efficient layouts and contemporary amenities. The gap between elite vision and lived experience was unbridgeable. By the mid-1960s, Nelson had firmly established himself as a dominant force in New York politics. He won re-election in 1962 and 1966 by comfortable margins. His approval ratings remained strong despite mounting concerns about state debt. He had reshaped New York's physical landscape and established himself as the most important governor in the state's modern history. But success in New York politics wasn't his ultimate goal. It was merely the platform from which to pursue the presidency. And here, despite all his money, all his accomplishments, all his energy and ambition, Nelson would face repeated humiliating defeats. His first serious presidential run came in 1960, when he challenged Richard Nixon for the Republican nomination. Nelson had money, accomplishments, and support from moderate Republicans, but he lacked Nixon's organizational strength and conservative support. He withdrew before the convention, having failed to dent Nixon's delegate advantage. The 1964 race proved even more damaging. Nelson divorced his wife Mary and married Margarita "Happy" Murphy, a woman 18 years his junior, who herself divorced to marry him. The scandal was enormous. A presidential candidate leaving his wife of 32 years for a younger woman violated 1960s social norms, even among sophisticated voters. Nelson pressed forward anyway, competing against Barry Goldwater, the conservative Arizona senator who represented everything Nelson opposed in Republican politics. At the 1964 Republican convention, Nelson gave a speech defending moderate republicanism that was booed so loudly by Goldwater delegates that he could barely be heard. The booing was televised nationally, a humiliating moment that crystallized Nelson's problem. Conservative Republicans hated his spending, his social liberalism, his elitism, and his willingness to divorce and remarry. Moderate Republicans appreciated his accomplishments but were uncomfortable with his personal life and worried about his electability. Goldwater won the nomination and then lost to Lyndon Johnson in a landslide. Republicans blamed Goldwater's conservatism for the defeat. Nelson thought this vindicated his moderate approach and positioned him perfectly for 1968. Look at the delusion here. Nelson genuinely believed that after the Goldwater disaster, Republicans would turn to him as the obvious alternative. He failed to grasp that his divorce and remarriage had permanently damaged his viability with conservative voters who dominated Republican primaries. The 1968 campaign proved this brutally. Nelson entered late. After Richard Nixon had already locked up most delegates, he spent millions on a last-minute effort to sway convention delegates, essentially trying to buy the nomination through personal appeals backed by unlimited resources. Nixon won on the first ballot. Nelson's expensive campaign accomplished nothing except demonstrating that even Rockefeller money couldn't overcome political fundamentals. His final attempt came in 1976, running against Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford. By this point, Nelson was 68 years old, had been divorced and remarried for over a decade, and represented a Republican tradition, moderate, pro-spending, socially liberal, that was increasingly out of step with the party's conservative turn. 4 attempts, tens of millions spent, 0 delegates secured. The presidency, the one thing Nelson wanted most, remained forever out of reach, mocking his ambition and exposing the limits of inherited wealth. Each failure drove him back to New York, where he could at least exercise the kind of power that national politics denied him. He built more buildings, created more agencies, issued more bonds. If he couldn't be president, he could at least transform an entire state into a monument to his vision. But the costs of this building spree were mounting in ways that would eventually create crisis. By the early 1970s, New York faced serious fiscal problems. The moral obligation bonds that had financed construction were coming due. The state budget was stretched thin, supporting operational costs of all the institutions Nelson had built. And the economy was weakening as New York lost manufacturing jobs to lower-cost regions. The empire Nelson built was starting to crumble under its own weight. And the worst was yet to come. By 1968, Nelson Rockefeller had spent over $20 million of his personal fortune trying to win the Republican presidential nomination, more money than most candidates spent on entire general election campaigns, and he had exactly 0 delegates to show for it. The 1968 Republican convention in Miami Beach was supposed to be Nelson's moment. Barry Goldwater's 1964 disaster had supposedly discredited conservative republicanism. The party was ready for a moderate who could win, Nelson's advisors assured him. His years governing New York had proven his executive competence. His progressive stance on civil rights positioned him perfectly for a changing America. Except, everything about this analysis was wrong. Richard Nixon had systematically rebuilt his political career after losing to John F. Kennedy in 1960. He'd spent years cultivating Republican officials, building delegate loyalty, and positioning himself as the steady alternative to both Goldwater conservatism and Rockefeller liberalism. By the time the convention opened, Nixon had the nomination locked up through old-fashioned political organizing. Nelson tried to counter with money and media. He ran television advertisements, attacking Nixon's viability in the general election. He hosted lavish parties for delegates at the Fontainebleau Hotel, complete with free food, drinks, and entertainment. He gave speech after speech, arguing that only he could defeat the Democrats. The delegates weren't impressed. They appreciated the free food but voted for Nixon anyway. Nelson's attempt to buy the nomination through personal appeals and expensive persuasion failed completely, a humiliating demonstration that political organization matters more than money. What made the defeat particularly galling was that Nixon then lost to Hubert Humphrey in an extremely close general election. If Nelson had been the nominee, he might have won, or so he convinced himself. The presidency that should have been his went instead to his longtime rival. You see, the relationship between Nixon and Rockefeller was poisoned by class resentment. Nixon, the California grocer's son who'd worked his way through law school, viewed Nelson as a spoiled aristocrat who'd never faced real struggle. Nelson, the aristocrat, viewed Nixon as a social inferior lacking vision and grace. Both were right about the other, and both let this mutual contempt poison their relationship. After the 1968 defeat, Nelson returned to New York and threw himself into governing with even greater intensity. If national politics rejected him, he'd make New York so successful that the country would beg him to run again. But by 1970, the cracks in Nelson's empire were becoming visible. The state budget had grown from $2 billion when he took office in 1959 to over $8 billion, a quadrupling in just 11 years. The moral obligation bonds that financed construction were piling up, creating tens of billions in debt that the state would eventually have to cover. And New York City was sliding toward its own fiscal crisis that would explode in the mid-1970s. Nelson's response to these warning signs was characteristic: ignore them and keep building. He won re-election in 1970 for a 4th term, though his margin was narrower than previous victories. Voters were starting to question whether his spending was sustainable. Editorial boards that had once praised his vision now warned about fiscal consequences. Bond rating agencies began expressing concern about New York's debt levels. None of this deterred Nelson. He saw himself as a builder, a visionary, someone operating on a timescale longer than electoral cycles or fiscal quarters. The monuments he was creating would serve New York for generations. The debt would be paid off eventually. Anyone who couldn't see this was thinking too small. I mean, think about the arrogance required to sustain this position. The state's entire financial establishment was raising alarms. Budget experts were warning of coming crisis. But Nelson, who'd never taken a course in public finance and whose personal fortune insulated him from financial consequences, was certain he knew better. The early 1970s also brought personal scandal that, while largely forgotten now, was explosive at the time. His wife Happy gave birth to a son in 1967, about 3 years after their marriage. But rumors persisted about Nelson's other relationships, his late nights away from the governor's mansion, and his behavior with young female staff members. The press, more deferential in that era than it would later become, largely avoided reporting on Nelson's personal life. But among political insiders, Nelson's appetite for extramarital affairs was well known. The contradiction between his public image as a devoted family man and his private behavior as a serial philanderer was accepted with a cynicism that feels jarring today. Here's what's interesting. Nelson seemed to genuinely believe he could compartmentalize his life, that private behavior didn't affect public credibility, that his accomplishments as governor should be judged separately from his personal morality. This compartmentalization, which had served him throughout his career, would ultimately contribute to the scandal surrounding his death. By 1973, after 14 years as governor, Nelson was exhausted and frustrated. He transformed New York, built monuments that would outlast him, and expanded state government in ways that would shape New York for decades. But the presidency still eluded him, and he'd be 68 in 1976, probably too old for another run. In December 1973, Nelson shocked New York politics by announcing he would not seek a fifth term in 1974. He was resigning the governorship to focus on national issues and work with his Commission on Critical Choices for Americans, a think tank he'd created to develop policy proposals. The real reason was simpler. He was tired of governing and wanted to position himself for one more presidential run in 1976. He'd concluded that being governor actually hurt his presidential ambitions. It tied him to New York's fiscal problems and gave opponents ammunition about spending and debt. His resignation left New York in precarious fiscal condition. The state was running deficits that required creative accounting to hide. The moral obligation bonds were coming due, and the state lacked revenue to cover them. The Urban Development Corporation was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, and New York City's own fiscal crisis was accelerating toward the 1975 near default that would require federal bailout. Nelson had built an empire, but he built it on borrowed money and creative accounting that couldn't sustain the weight. When the economic slowdown of the mid-1970s reduced tax revenue, the whole structure began collapsing. But Nelson wouldn't be there to face the consequences. He'd moved on to his next act, a final attempt at reaching the presidency through an unexpected path. When Richard Nixon resigned in August 1974, to avoid impeachment, Vice President Gerald Ford became president. Ford needed to nominate a vice president under the 25th Amendment, which had been ratified in 1967, specifically to handle such situations. Nelson wanted the job desperately. Yes, it was the vice presidency, not the presidency, but it was a national office. It would make him heir apparent for 1976, and it would finally give him the Washington power that had eluded him for decades. Ford considered multiple candidates, but ultimately chose Nelson for a combination of political and personal reasons. Nelson had executive experience, national stature, and moderate credentials that could help Ford unify the Republican Party after Watergate. Plus, Ford genuinely respected Nelson despite their political differences. On August 20, 1974, Ford announced Nelson Rockefeller as his vice presidential nominee. Nelson accepted with barely concealed joy. Finally, national office. Finally, legitimate claim to the presidential succession. Finally, the recognition he pursued for 2 decades. What Nelson didn't anticipate was the confirmation process ahead. The Senate and House both had to confirm vice presidential nominees under the 25th Amendment, and unlike previous eras, when confirmation hearings were perfunctory, the post-Watergate Congress was in no mood to rubber-stamp presidential choices. The confirmation hearings exposed every aspect of Nelson's life to scrutiny. His personal finances, including gifts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to political associates who'd helped his career, his gubernatorial record, including the Attica prison disaster that we'll examine in detail shortly, his family wealth raising questions about potential conflicts of interest. Nelson was forced to disclose that his personal wealth exceeded $62 million, equivalent to hundreds of millions today, and that he'd given over $2 million in gifts and loans to political associates over the years. These gifts included $50,000 to Henry Kissinger, $85,000 to William Ronan, a close aide, and similar amounts to others who'd helped his career. The gifts weren't illegal, but they highlighted how Nelson used personal wealth to build political loyalty in ways that ordinary politicians couldn't match. He was essentially paying retainers to talented people to ensure their services were needed. Look at the double standard this created. Nelson could afford to hire the best political minds, commission unlimited polling, and build political networks through personal generosity. His opponents had to rely on smaller donor bases and conventional fundraising. The playing field wasn't level. It was tilted by billions in inherited wealth. After months of hearings, both houses of Congress confirmed Nelson, though with more opposition than expected. He became vice president on December 19, 1974, finally achieving national office at age 66. But the position would prove far more frustrating than he'd anticipated. Ford didn't trust Nelson with real power, fearing he'd overshadow the president or pursue his own agenda. Nelson was excluded from key decisions, given ceremonial duties, and generally treated as a political liability rather than a governing partner. The final humiliation came in 1975, when Ford made clear he would keep Nelson as his running mate for the 1976 election. The Republican right wing hated Nelson's liberalism and viewed him as symbolic of everything wrong with the party establishment. Ford needed conservative support to fight off Ronald Reagan's primary challenge. On November 3, 1975, Ford announced that Nelson had voluntarily withdrawn from consideration for the 1976 ticket. Everyone understood this was forced. Ford had dumped him to appease conservatives. Nelson's political career was essentially over. No presidency, no vice presidency beyond the brief appointed term. Just a record of brilliant building in New York, mixed with fiscal irresponsibility and a personal life that would end in scandal. September 9, 1971, began as a normal Thursday at Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York. By the end of the day, inmates had seized control of the prison, taken 42 hostages, and sparked the deadliest prison confrontation in American history. The uprising didn't happen spontaneously. Attica was a powder keg that had been building pressure for years. The prison housed nearly 2,200 inmates, 54% of them black, 9% Puerto Rican, all guarded by an entirely white staff. Inmates faced medieval conditions: 1 shower per week, 1 roll of toilet paper per month, brutal discipline for minor infractions. The racial dynamics were explosive. Many of the black inmates were from New York City, radicalized by the civil rights and black power movements. They viewed their white guards as racist oppressors. The guards, mostly from rural upstate New York, viewed the inmates as dangerous criminals who deserved harsh treatment. Prison reform advocates had warned Nelson repeatedly that New York's prisons were overcrowded, underfunded, and managed with 19th century brutality. He'd commissioned studies, visited facilities, and promised improvements, but actual reforms came slowly, buried under budget constraints and resistance from correction officers' unions. When the uprising began, approximately 1,000 inmates overpowered guards during morning roll call, seized control of several cell blocks, and took hostages to a central courtyard. They issued demands: better living conditions, amnesty for the uprising, and transportation to a non-imperialist country. The demands were partly reasonable, living conditions, partly impossible transportation to Cuba or Algeria, and partly designed to frame the uprising as political resistance rather than criminal rebellion. Nelson was in New York City when the crisis began. His initial response was to delegate. He appointed Russell Oswald, the state corrections commissioner, to handle negotiations. Oswald was a reformer who believed in rehabilitation over punishment, exactly the kind of progressive administrator Nelson favored. For 4 days, Oswald negotiated with inmate leaders while the nation watched. News cameras captured the scene. Inmates in the courtyard holding knives to hostages' throats, negotiators trying to reach peaceful resolution, family members of both inmates and hostages pleading for compromise. The inmates selected a negotiating committee that included radical activists like Bobby Seale of the Black Panthers, lawyer William Kunster, and journalist Tom Wicker. These outside observers added legitimacy to the inmates' grievances, but also made compromise harder. The inmates now had audience for their political theater. Oswald agreed to 28 of 29 inmate demands, including improved conditions, more religious freedom, and better medical care. But he couldn't agree to complete amnesty. State law required prosecution of crimes committed during the uprising, including the death of a guard who'd been beaten during the initial takeover. This stalemate continued through September 12. Nelson, watching from a distance, faced pressure from multiple directions. Liberal allies urged him to go to Attica personally and broker a deal. Law enforcement officials urged him to retake the prison by force. Editorial writers debated whether negotiating with inmates legitimized criminal behavior. Here's what's critical to understand. Nelson viewed the Attica uprising through the lens of order versus chaos, not as a legitimate grievance requiring his personal attention. He saw inmates who'd committed crimes facing consequences, guards who'd been taken hostage needing rescue, and a prison that needed to be returned to state control. The idea that he should personally negotiate with convicted criminals struck him as absurd. Nelson Rockefeller didn't negotiate with people who took hostages. He gave orders, and the orders were executed. This aristocratic certainty would have deadly consequences. On September 13, after inmates rejected Oswald's final offer and killed one hostage in apparent retaliation, Nelson made his decision: retake the prison by force. He ordered state police to assault the facility using tear gas and, if necessary, gunfire. You see, Nelson never seriously considered the alternative of going to Attica himself to negotiate. Multiple advisors urged him to make the trip. It was only a few hours' drive from Albany. His presence might have given inmates the symbolic victory they needed to surrender peacefully, but Nelson refused, dismissing such suggestions as weakness. The assault began at 9:46 a.m. on September 13. State police launched tear gas into the courtyard, where inmates held hostages. Sharpshooters positioned on roofs opened fire. Other troopers stormed into the prison firing shotguns. The assault lasted 15 minutes. When it ended, 39 people were dead, 29 inmates, and 10 hostages. Another 89 people were wounded. It was the deadliest prison uprising in American history, and every single death was caused by state police gunfire, not inmate weapons. The initial reports, based on state officials' claims, said inmates had killed hostages by slitting their throats. This matched public expectations. Of course, violent criminals would kill hostages when rescue came. News media reported these claims as fact, but autopsies revealed the truth. Hostages died from gunshot wounds, not knives. State police had shot them during the chaotic assault, either mistaking them for inmates in the tear gas fog or through wild firing into the crowded courtyard. The state had killed the very hostages it claimed to be rescuing. Nelson's immediate response was defiance. He defended the assault as necessary to restore order and prevent further hostage deaths. He praised the state police for their courage. He showed no public remorse for the 39 dead. I mean, look at the mindset this reveals. Nelson genuinely believed that restoring order justified the deaths. The inmates had rebelled against legitimate authority. They'd taken hostages, therefore whatever force was necessary to end the rebellion was justified. The hostage deaths were tragic but acceptable collateral damage. This aristocratic certainty, the absolute conviction that state authority must be maintained regardless of cost, defined Nelson's response throughout the crisis and its aftermath. The cover-up began almost immediately. State officials initially claimed inmates had killed hostages. When autopsies disproved this, they claimed inmates had used hostages as shields, forcing police to shoot through them. When this proved false, they claimed the assault was the only option to prevent further hostage deaths. None of these justifications held up under scrutiny. The inmates hadn't killed any hostages during the uprising. Negotiations were still ongoing when Nelson ordered the assault. Alternative approaches, including Nelson going to Attica personally, hadn't been seriously attempted. The political fallout was severe but not fatal to Nelson's career. Liberals condemned the assault as state murder. Conservatives praised Nelson for refusing to negotiate with criminals. The black community viewed Attica as confirmation that the justice system valued white lives over black lives. 10 white hostages dead from police fire, but it was the 29 dead inmates who were blamed. Congressional hearings investigated the assault. The McKay Commission, appointed by Nelson himself, ultimately concluded that the assault was unjustified and that Nelson bore responsibility for ordering it without exhausting peaceful alternatives. But Nelson never admitted error. In his autobiography, published years later, he defended the decision and claimed he'd had no choice. The inmates were violent criminals who'd taken hostages. The state had to restore order. Any other outcome would have encouraged future uprisings. Here's what's interesting. Nelson's Attica response perfectly captured both his strengths and his fatal flaws. He was decisive, willing to make hard choices, and immune to political pressure. These qualities served him well in many situations. Building institutions requires steamrolling opposition, but the same qualities made him blind to human cost, deaf to moral complexity, and incapable of the empathy that might have prevented tragedy. When the situation required negotiation, compromise, and personal engagement, Nelson offered only force and certainty. The long-term consequences of Attica reverberated for decades. New York reformed prison conditions, though not as thoroughly as advocates demanded. The families of dead inmates sued the state, eventually winning settlements. The surviving inmates who'd been beaten and tortured by guards after the assault sued as well, receiving compensation only after decades of legal battles. But Nelson faced no personal consequences beyond political criticism. He wasn't prosecuted. He didn't lose his next election. When Ford nominated him for vice president in 1974, Attica was raised during confirmation hearings, but didn't prevent his appointment. This impunity reflected both Nelson's political power and a broader truth about American justice. Powerful people rarely face accountability for decisions that kill less powerful people. The guards who beat inmates after the assault faced minimal discipline. The officers whose wild firing killed hostages were never charged. The system protected its own. Look at the class dimension. If a poor person makes a decision that results in 39 deaths, they go to prison for life. When a governor makes such a decision, it's characterized as a tragic but defensible choice by a leader facing impossible circumstances. The racial dimension was equally stark. The dead inmates were disproportionately black and Puerto Rican. The hostages killed by police were white, yet the public narrative focused on inmate violence rather than state violence. The systemic racism that created Attica's brutal conditions, and the racism embedded in the decision to assault rather than negotiate, was acknowledged but never meaningfully addressed. Attica revealed that beneath Nelson's progressive rhetoric about civil rights and social justice lay a harder truth. When order conflicted with justice, he chose order. When his authority was challenged, he crushed the challenge. When faced with complexity requiring patience and compromise, he opted for force and certainty. These impulses had built empires. The highways, universities, and buildings that transformed New York required exactly this kind of determined force. But those same impulses, applied to human beings rather than construction projects, produced tragedy. The question that haunts Nelson's legacy is whether Attica was an aberration or a revelation. Was it a mistake by an otherwise progressive leader? Or was it the inevitable result of an aristocratic governing philosophy that valued order, authority, and grand vision over democratic process, human cost, and moral complexity? The answer matters because it determines how we understand not just Nelson Rockefeller, but the entire tradition of elite, technocratic governance that he embodied. If experts and visionaries can build better societies than democratic processes allow, then perhaps Attica-style tragedies are acceptable costs. If they can't, if elite certainty produces disasters as often as triumphs, then we need different models of governance. Nelson never grappled seriously with this question. He died convinced that his achievements outweighed his failures, that history would vindicate his vision, and that Attica, while regrettable, didn't undermine his legacy of progressive governance and institution building. Whether history has vindicated that view remains contested terrain. Nelson Rockefeller's vice presidency, which lasted from December 1974 to January 1977, was a masterclass in how not to exercise the second highest office in American government. He entered the position with grand ambitions. Finally, after 4 failed presidential campaigns and 15 years governing New York, he had a national platform. He would be President Ford's domestic policy leader, the architect of Republican renewal after Watergate, the elder statesman guiding America through crisis. Within months, it became clear that Ford had no intention of giving Nelson real power. The relationship between Ford and Rockefeller was cordial on the surface, but fundamentally strained. Ford was a Midwestern conservative who'd spent 25 years in Congress building relationships through patience and compromise. Nelson was an Eastern aristocrat who'd governed through executive authority and unlimited resources. Their styles clashed completely. Ford assigned Nelson to chair the Domestic Council, which sounded important, but actually meant coordinating agencies that reported to cabinet secretaries, not the vice president. Nelson threw himself into the work, commissioning studies, proposing initiatives, and trying to shape domestic policy. But Ford's staff systematically blocked him. Chief of Staff Donald Rumsfeld, who would later serve as defense secretary under 2 presidents, viewed Nelson as a political threat and worked to minimize his influence. Dick Cheney, then Rumsfeld's deputy, shared this view. Both men represented a younger, more conservative generation of Republicans who saw Nelson as a relic of a discredited moderate tradition. You see, the Republican Party was moving right in the mid-1970s, and Nelson represented everything the ascendant conservative movement opposed. He'd governed New York as a big-spending liberal. He supported abortion rights, gun control, environmental regulation, and aggressive government intervention in the economy. To conservatives, he was barely Republican at all. Ronald Reagan's challenge to Ford in the 1976 primaries crystallized this dynamic. Reagan explicitly attacked Ford for choosing Nelson as vice president, calling it a betrayal of conservative principles. The challenge gained traction, forcing Ford to fight desperately for the nomination. Ford's political advisors delivered the verdict: keeping Nelson on the ticket would cost Ford the conservative support needed to defeat Reagan and then win the general election. Nelson had to go. The official announcement came in November 1975. Nelson was voluntarily withdrawing from consideration for the 1976. The spin was that he wanted to avoid being a distraction. Everyone understood the truth. Ford had dumped him to appease the right wing. The humiliation was total. Not only had Nelson failed to win the presidency himself, but he'd been rejected as vice president by a man he considered his intellectual inferior. Ford was a decent, honest politician, but he lacked Nelson's vision, education, and accomplishments. Yet Ford was president, and Ford was firing him. I mean, think about what this meant for Nelson's self-conception. He'd spent his entire adult life pursuing power, convinced that his combination of family name, personal wealth, and progressive vision entitled him to leadership. He built monuments across New York. He'd transformed institutions. He'd proven his capacity to govern. And yet, democratic politics kept rejecting him. The voters didn't want him. The party didn't want him. Even a president who'd appointed him didn't want him. This rejection contained an important lesson about American democracy that Nelson never fully absorbed. Inherited wealth and elite credentials don't automatically translate to political legitimacy. Voters can smell aristocratic entitlement, and many of them resent it even when the aristocrats' policies might benefit them. Nelson's remaining time as vice president was essentially ceremonial. He presided over the Senate, traveled internationally, and gave speeches. But he had no real power, and everyone knew it. The one area where he did exercise influence was intelligence oversight. Nelson chaired the commission investigating CIA abuses, including illegal domestic surveillance, assassination plots against foreign leaders, and human experimentation programs. The Rockefeller Commission, as it became known, exposed serious wrongdoing while also being criticized for not going far enough. Here's what's interesting. Nelson approached intelligence oversight with the same elite paternalism he brought to everything else. He believed intelligence agencies needed broad authority to protect national security, but also that abuses should be prevented through better management and oversight by responsible officials like himself. This faith in elite oversight, rather than democratic accountability, reflected Nelson's broader governing philosophy. He didn't trust public opinion or messy democratic processes. He trusted experts, leaders, and institutions run by responsible people with proper judgment. The problem, which the CIA abuses demonstrated, was that even responsible elites commit terrible abuses when insulated from accountability. The very experts Nelson trusted had authorized assassination attempts, illegal surveillance, and human experimentation. Elite judgment had failed catastrophically. But Nelson drew different lessons. He concluded that the problem was insufficient oversight by the right kind of leaders like himself. The solution was better elite management, not democratic control. His personal life during the vice presidency generated increasing gossip. Happy Rockefeller, his second wife, largely avoided Washington, preferring to stay in New York with their children. Nelson maintained his Manhattan townhouse and spent considerable time there, away from the vice president's residence. Rumors circulated about his relationships with female staff members, particularly Meghan Marshak, a young aide who'd joined his staff during the gubernatorial years and followed him to Washington. The gossip was whispered rather than published. The press was more deferential in that era. But political insiders knew that Nelson's pattern of extramarital affairs continued. What made this behavior particularly reckless was that as vice president, Nelson was under far more scrutiny than as governor. The Secret Service tracked his movements. Reporters watched his schedule. Political opponents would have loved to catch him in compromising situations. Yet Nelson seemed to believe he was untouchable. The wealth, the name, the position, all created a sense of invulnerability. He'd weathered the scandal of divorcing and remarrying while pursuing the presidency. He'd survived Attica. Why worry about gossip regarding personal behavior? This hubris would contribute directly to the scandal surrounding his death. As 1976 ended and Jimmy Carter's inauguration approached, Nelson faced the reality that his political career was over. At 68, he was too old for another presidential run. No one was going to offer him a cabinet position or ambassadorship. His political brand was toxic to both parties. He would leave office as he'd entered politics, fabulously wealthy, well-connected, accomplished in some ways, but ultimately frustrated in his deepest ambitions. Look at what he'd achieved. Transformed New York's physical landscape, built the largest state university system in America, championed civil rights and environmental protection when both were politically risky. These were genuine accomplishments that improved millions of lives, but measured against his ambitions, the presidency, lasting influence over national policy, a place in history as one of America's great leaders, Nelson had failed. He'd spent over $17 million of personal wealth on politics and had exactly one appointed vice presidential term to show for it. The psychological toll was evident to those close to him. He grew irritable, dismissive of Ford and his staff, increasingly focused on his post-political career. He wanted to write books, run his art foundation, and work on international development issues that had always interested him. In January 1977, Nelson Rockefeller left public office for the last time. He would live exactly 2 more years, dying under circumstances that would generate one final scandal, perfectly capturing the contradictions of his life. The aristocrat who preached public service while pursuing private pleasure, the builder of monuments who died in another man's wife's apartment, the man who'd spent his life seeking respect, but whose death became a tabloid punchline. The vice presidency had been his final act in electoral politics, and it was a failure. But the buildings remained, the universities remained, the debt remained, and the question of how to judge this complicated, ambitious, flawed man remained unanswered. The fiscal crisis that exploded in New York during the mid-1970s was, in many ways, Nelson Rockefeller's legacy coming due. By 1975, just 2 years after Nelson left the governorship, New York faced potential bankruptcy. The Urban Development Corporation, which Nelson had created to build housing and commercial projects across the state, defaulted on $100 million in bonds. New York City teetered on the edge of default, unable to sell bonds to finance operations. The moral obligation bonds that Nelson had used to hide billions in construction debt were coming due, and the state lacked revenue to cover them. The beautiful buildings, the expanded university system, the highways and cultural centers, all those monuments to Nelson's vision, now threatened to bankrupt the state. Governor Hugh Carey, who succeeded Nelson's hand-picked replacement Malcolm Wilson, inherited a fiscal disaster. State debt had exploded from $2 billion in 1959, when Nelson took office, to over $13 billion by 1975. Annual debt service consumed an increasing portion of the state budget, and the chickens were coming home to roost. What made this particularly galling was that Nelson had known exactly what he was doing. The moral obligation bonds weren't an accounting error. They were a deliberate scheme to circumvent constitutional limits on state borrowing. Nelson had been warned repeatedly by fiscal conservatives that this debt would eventually create crisis. He'd dismissed those warnings as small-minded thinking that couldn't appreciate his grand vision. Now the vision had produced exactly the crisis his critics had predicted. The New York City component deserves particular attention because it revealed how Nelson's policies had contributed to urban decay, even while he claimed to be addressing it. The city's near bankruptcy in 1975 resulted from multiple factors, but Nelson's governorship had accelerated several of them. His housing and urban renewal policies had displaced working-class and middle-class residents from Manhattan, pushing them to suburbs or to poorer neighborhoods. The construction of highways through city neighborhoods had destroyed communities and made inner cities less livable. His welfare and Medicaid expansions, while humane, had created obligations the state couldn't afford during economic downturns. You see, Nelson had governed as though economic growth would continue forever, generating tax revenue to cover any spending. When growth stopped, as it did during the 1970s stagflation, the model collapsed. The programs he'd built required perpetual expansion to fund. When expansion stopped, crisis was inevitable. President Ford's response to New York City's crisis was captured in a famous New York Daily News headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead." The actual quote was more nuanced, but the message was clear: the federal government wouldn't bail out a city that had spent itself into crisis. This infuriated Nelson, who by then was Ford's vice president. He pushed aggressively for federal assistance, arguing that New York's crisis threatened the entire national economy. Ford eventually agreed to limited loan guarantees, but only after New York had implemented brutal austerity measures. The austerity required to avoid bankruptcy fell hardest on poor and working-class New Yorkers. City services were cut, teachers and police were laid off, libraries and firehouses closed, subway service deteriorated. The quality of life in New York City, particularly for its poorest residents, declined dramatically. Meanwhile, Nelson's monuments stood as reminders of different priorities. The Empire State Plaza's marble towers gleamed in Albany, while the state struggled to pay debt service. The SUNY campuses operated even as state support for operations was slashed. The highways carried traffic while the subway system crumbled from deferred maintenance. I mean, look at the class dimension here. Nelson's building programs had created construction jobs and architectural monuments that primarily benefited middle-class and wealthy New Yorkers. The fiscal crisis that resulted imposed costs disproportionately on poor New Yorkers who depended on public services. The elite had enjoyed the benefits of Nelson's spending. The poor would pay the costs of the resulting debt. This pattern, privatizing benefits while socializing costs, was not unique to Nelson, but he practiced it on a scale that dwarfed most politicians. His personal wealth insulated him from consequences. His monuments bore his name, while others paid the bills. The political consequences of the fiscal crisis were severe for the Republican Party in New York. The party was blamed for decades of excessive borrowing and spending. Democrats won control of state government and held it for a generation. The Rockefeller Republican tradition, fiscally aggressive, socially liberal, was discredited. Nationally, the fiscal crisis contributed to the conservative turn in American politics. Ronald Reagan used New York as a cautionary tale about what happens when liberals control government. The argument was simple. Look at New York, bankrupt from decades of Democratic and Rockefeller Republican spending. Do you want that for America? This narrative was unfair in some ways. The fiscal crisis resulted from complex factors beyond any one governor's control. But it was also accurate in capturing how Nelson's spending had created unsustainable obligations. Here's what's interesting. Nelson himself seemed genuinely surprised that his governorship was being blamed for the fiscal crisis. He'd left office in 1973. The crisis hit in 1975. Wasn't that his successor's problem? This attitude revealed Nelson's fundamental disconnect from accountability. He'd created the obligations, designed the debt schemes, and built the institutions that required ongoing funding. But he viewed the fiscal consequences as someone else's concern. He was a builder, a visionary. Managing the resulting costs was for lesser people. His post-vice presidency period, brief though it was, showed a man desperate to rebuild his reputation. He wrote his autobiography, emphasizing his accomplishments while glossing over controversies like Attica and the fiscal legacy. He gave speeches about international development and commissioned art for his personal collection. But he also seemed increasingly lost. Politics had been his identity for 4 decades. Without it, what was he? A rich man with an art collection and a controversial legacy. That wasn't the historical significance he'd envisioned. The art collection itself is worth examining because it revealed Nelson's aesthetic vision and priorities. He'd spent hundreds of millions, much of it on modern and contemporary art that pushed boundaries and challenged conventions. The collection included works by Picasso, Matisse, and Miro, as well as African and pre-Columbian art. Nelson viewed art collecting the way he viewed governing, as an opportunity for bold vision backed by unlimited resources. He didn't collect safe, traditional art. He collected work that was challenging, controversial, and ambitious, qualities he valued in himself. After his death, much of the collection was donated to museums, particularly the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which his mother Abby had helped found. This philanthropy allowed the Rockefeller name to be associated with cultural achievement rather than just political controversy. But philanthropy couldn't erase the political legacy. New York would spend decades digging out from under the debt Nelson had created. The UDC wouldn't fully recover until the 1990s. The state's bond rating, damaged by the crisis, took years to restore. The human cost was measured in services not provided, infrastructure not maintained, and opportunities not funded because debt service consumed resources that might have been used productively. Every dollar spent on debt service for Nelson's buildings was a dollar not available for current needs. Look at the irony. Nelson had governed believing that grand public works would serve New York for generations. In a sense, he was right. The buildings, universities, and highways he built do serve the state. But the debt he created to build them also burdened New York for generations, constraining future leaders' options and forcing austerity that harmed vulnerable populations. This is the essential Nelson-Rockefeller paradox: brilliant vision yoked to fiscal recklessness, genuine progressive instincts paired with aristocratic indifference to consequences, ambition to serve society combined with ambition to be remembered as great. Judging this legacy requires deciding which mattered more: the monuments built or the costs imposed, the vision pursued or the methods employed, the public accomplishments or the private behavior. Nelson himself never seriously grappled with these questions. He was certain of his righteousness, confident in his methods, and convinced that history would vindicate his vision. The fact that democratic politics kept rejecting him, that voters, party leaders, and fellow Republicans found him too liberal, too expensive, too elitist, too divorced from ordinary concerns, never shook this certainty. By early 1979, Nelson was 70 years old, 2 years out of office, and drifting without the political purpose that had structured his adult life. He maintained an office, worked on his art projects, and gave occasional speeches. But the energy and drive that had once transformed New York had no outlet. He was also continuing the pattern of extramarital affairs that had defined his personal life for decades. Meghan Marshak, his former aide, was often at his Manhattan townhouse, ostensibly working on a book about his art collection. The nature of their relationship was ambiguous, at least publicly. But among those close to Nelson, it was understood that his interest wasn't purely professional. At 70, married to Happy for 15 years, Nelson was still pursuing the same pattern that had defined his life: compartmentalizing private behavior from public image, assuming his wealth and power made him immune to normal consequences. On January 26, 1979, that assumption would finally fail him. Nelson Rockefeller died at approximately 10:15 p.m. on Friday, January 26, 1979, though the exact time and circumstances remain disputed. The official story, released by the family, was that he suffered a heart attack while working at his desk in his Manhattan townhouse at 13 West 54th Street. He was alone when he collapsed. An aide found him and called for help. He was pronounced dead at Lenox Hill Hospital. This story was false in nearly every detail. What actually happened was this: Nelson was at his townhouse with Meghan Marshak, his 25-year-old former aide. They were alone together. At some point around 10 p.m., he suffered what appeared to be a heart attack. Marshak panicked, and instead of immediately calling 911, first called a friend, Ponchita Pierce, a news reporter, before finally calling for medical help. The delay was approximately 1 hour. By the time paramedics arrived, Nelson was beyond saving. He was transported to Lenox Hill Hospital and pronounced dead at 11:15 p.m., not 10:15 as initially reported. The facts emerged slowly and scandalously. Reporters noticed inconsistencies in the official timeline. The hospital records didn't match the family's statements, and slowly the truth leaked out. The vice president had died in circumstances suggesting he was with a much younger woman in his townhouse, late at night, while his wife was elsewhere. The tabloids had a field day. Headlines played on the obvious implications. Late-night comedians made jokes. The Rockefeller family's attempt to control the narrative had failed, and Nelson's death became exactly the kind of tawdry scandal that his life had somehow avoided. Here's what made the scandal particularly rich. Nelson had spent his entire career cultivating an image of public service and family values. He'd weathered the divorce and remarriage scandal by insisting on his devotion to Happy. He positioned himself as a man of character, despite persistent rumors of affairs. And then he died in circumstances that confirmed every suspicion, validated every rumor, and reduced his legacy to tabloid fodder. The Rockefeller family closed ranks, refused to comment beyond brief statements, and tried to focus attention on Nelson's accomplishments rather than the circumstances of his death. They succeeded partly. The funeral was dignified, the obituaries emphasized his governorship and building programs, and the tawdry details eventually faded from headlines. but the damage to his reputation was permanent. For many Americans, Nelson Rockefeller became the punchline to a joke about powerful men dying in embarrassing circumstances. The monuments he'd built, the institutions he'd created, the policies he'd championed, all were overshadowed by the scandal of his death. I mean, think about the symbolism. A man who'd spent his life pursuing power and respect, who'd built monuments designed to establish his legacy, who'd cared deeply about how history would remember him, dying in circumstances that reduced him to tabloid material. The autopsy revealed that Nelson had indeed suffered a massive heart attack. At 70, overweight and under the stress of adjusting to life without political power, he was at high risk. The heart attack would likely have been fatal regardless of how quickly help arrived. But the delay in calling for help, the initial lies about the circumstances, and the nature of his relationship with Marshak all raised questions that have never been definitively answered. Was he having an affair with her? Was the relationship consensual given the 45-year age difference and power imbalance? Why did Marshak delay calling for help? The Rockefeller family paid Marshak substantial sums after Nelson's death, officially for her work on the art book, though many suspected it was hush money to prevent her from speaking publicly about the relationship. She never did speak publicly, maintaining silence about that night for over 40 years. The estate settlement revealed that Nelson left behind approximately $180 million in personal wealth, equivalent to over $700 million today. He'd spent tens of millions on politics and art collecting, but the Rockefeller fortune had continued generating wealth that dwarfed his spending. His will included provisions for Happy and their children, for his children from his first marriage, and for various foundations and cultural institutions. But notably absent was any mention of Marshak or acknowledgement of their relationship. Look at how the legacy stands today, over 40 years after his death. The monuments endure. The Empire State Plaza dominates Albany's skyline. The State University of New York educates hundreds of thousands. The highways carry traffic. Rockefeller Center and Lincoln Center remain Manhattan landmarks. But the political tradition he represented, Rockefeller republicanism, is extinct. The modern Republican Party has no place for socially liberal, fiscally aggressive, elite-driven governance. The party has moved so far right that Nixon and Eisenhower would be considered moderates, and Nelson would be considered a Democrat. His progressive accomplishments on civil rights, environmental protection, and education access are largely forgotten by the public, overshadowed by the fiscal crisis his spending created and the scandal of his death. The critical question is whether history should judge Nelson primarily by his accomplishments or his methods, by what he built or what it cost, by his public achievements or his private behavior. The case for a positive legacy emphasizes transformed New York's infrastructure and educational system, championed civil rights and environmental protection when both were politically risky, built institutions that served millions of New Yorkers decades later, demonstrated that progressive governance could accomplish ambitious goals. The case for a negative legacy emphasizes created unsustainable debt that burdened New York for decades, ordered the Attica assault that killed 39 people, used inherited wealth to buy political influence in ways that undermined democratic equality, governed with aristocratic arrogance that prioritized vision over consent, personal behavior that contradicted public image. Both cases are true. The question is which matters more. Here's what's interesting. Nelson's legacy might be most significant, not for what he accomplished, but for what he represented. The last gasp of a particular kind of elite, progressive, institution-building governance that flourished in the mid-20th century and then died out. The post-World War II era saw tremendous faith in government's capacity to solve social problems through expert planning and ambitious programs. The interstate highway system, the space program, the expansion of higher education all reflected confidence that government led by capable people could transform society. Nelson embodied this faith to an extreme degree. He genuinely believed that with sufficient will, resources and vision, government could reshape landscapes, eliminate poverty, provide universal opportunity, and create a more just society. By the 1970s, this faith was collapsing. Vietnam, Watergate, stagflation, urban decay, and fiscal crisis all undermined confidence in government's competence and benevolence. The conservative movement that brought Reagan to power explicitly rejected the kind of activist government Nelson championed. Nelson's death in 1979 coincided almost exactly with the political death of the tradition he represented. Reagan's election in 1980 would cement the conservative ascendancy that made Rockefeller republicanism obsolete. Whether that era deserves nostalgia or deserves to remain dead is itself a contested question. Those who believe expert-led government can address complex social problems see Nelson's governorship as proof of concept. Look at what visionary leadership accomplished despite democratic messiness and fiscal constraints. Those who believe elite governance inevitably becomes arrogant, expensive, and disconnected from democratic accountability see Nelson as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even brilliant, well-intentioned leaders can impose terrible costs when insulated from consequences. The truth, as usual, probably lies between these extremes. Nelson built impressive institutions while creating fiscal disaster. He dedicated his life to public service while pursuing private pleasure. He was both better and worse than his reputation suggests. His complicated, contradictory legacy reflects complicated, contradictory commitments, genuine progressive vision paired with aristocratic arrogance, authentic desire to serve combined with authentic ambition to be remembered, real accomplishments achieved through questionable methods. Perhaps the most honest assessment is the simplest. Nelson Rockefeller was an enormously talented, enormously flawed man who used inherited billions to pursue power, built monuments that outlasted him, and died in scandal that overshadowed his achievements. He wanted desperately to be great and remembered. He was certainly remembered, though not always for the reasons he'd hoped. So we've seen how the grandson of America's first billionaire spent $73 million trying to buy the presidency, transformed an entire state through sheer force of will, and borrowed money, and died under circumstances that reduced a lifetime of achievement to tabloid scandal. Nelson Rockefeller's story resists the simple moral categories we prefer for historical figures. He wasn't a hero who dedicated his life selflessly to public service. He pursued power as aggressively as his grandfather had pursued monopoly. But he wasn't a villain either. He genuinely believed in progressive governance and built institutions that improved millions of lives. The monuments he left behind tell part of the story. Drive through New York and you'll see his legacy everywhere. The Empire State Plaza's modernist towers in Albany, the SUNY campuses across the state, the highways connecting cities, the cultural institutions in Manhattan. These weren't just buildings. They were Nelson's vision made concrete, his ambition carved in stone and steel. But look closer and you'll see the other side of the legacy. The neighborhoods demolished to build his projects, the debt that constrained New York's choices for decades, the fiscal crisis that forced austerity on the poor while his monuments stood gleaming, the Attica victims who died when his aristocratic certainty chose force over negotiation. Today, over 45 years after his death, Nelson Rockefeller has largely faded from public memory. His name appears on buildings most New Yorkers pass without recognizing the reference. Young people have no idea who built the institutions they use daily. The man who desperately wanted historical significance has been reduced to a vaguely familiar name, attached to structures whose origins nobody remembers. This anonymity would have horrified Nelson. He built monuments precisely to be remembered. He pursued power partly for its own sake, but also to leave a mark on history. The idea that he might be forgotten, that his grand vision might fade into generic, old buildings built by somebody sometime, was the outcome he feared most. Yet perhaps this fading is appropriate. The tradition Nelson represented, Rockefeller republicanism, progressive governance funded by massive borrowing, elite expertise reshaping society, is as extinct as he is. The modern Republican Party would view him as a liberal Democrat. The Democratic Party would be horrified by his fiscal methods and authoritarian governance style. He fits nowhere in contemporary politics. The real lesson here isn't about Nelson specifically, but about the relationship between wealth, power, and democracy. Nelson proved that inherited billions can build political careers and physical monuments. But he also proved that money can't buy respect, democratic legitimacy, or the ultimate political prize. He spent more personal wealth on politics than almost anyone in American history, and lost every presidential race he entered. He built more as governor than any of his predecessors, but left office with New York on the verge of bankruptcy. He reached the vice presidency only to be dumped as politically inconvenient. He died in scandal that overshadowed his achievements. What does this tell us about American democracy? Perhaps that it's more resilient to money's influence than cynics suggest. Yes, Nelson's wealth gave him advantages no normal candidate could match. But voters still rejected him. Party leaders still chose others. Democratic processes still constrained his ambitions. Or perhaps it tells us something different, that wealth and elite credentials breed arrogance that ultimately proves self-defeating. Nelson's certainty that he knew better than voters, party leaders, and fiscal experts repeatedly undermined his ambitions. His aristocratic inability to accept democratic constraints made him politically toxic despite his accomplishments. Whether we like it or not, Nelson Rockefeller represents a permanent tension in American life. We claim to value democratic equality while also respecting expertise, achievement, and vision. We want leaders who can think big and build impressively, but we resent aristocrats who act entitled to power. We celebrate monuments to civic achievement while criticizing the costs and methods required to build them. This tension has no resolution because it reflects genuine competing values. We need ambitious leaders willing to pursue long-term visions despite short-term political costs. But we also need democratic accountability to prevent ambitious leaders from becoming autocrats who impose their visions regardless of public consent or fiscal sustainability. Nelson lived on the wrong side of this tension. He had the vision and the willingness to ignore short-term politics, but he lacked the accountability and the respect for democratic processes that should constrain even visionary leaders. As we face contemporary challenges, climate change, infrastructure decay, educational access inequality, Nelson's example offers both inspiration and warning. Inspiration because he proved that determined leaders with resources can accomplish transformative change. Warning because he also proved that even brilliant, progressive leaders can create disasters when insulated from consequences and convinced of their own righteousness. The buildings remain. The highways remain. The debt restructured, refinanced, but never fully repaid, remains. And the question of whether what Nelson built justified what it cost remains contested. So the question persists. Was Nelson Rockefeller a visionary who transformed New York for the better despite short-sighted critics, or an arrogant aristocrat who imposed his vision regardless of democratic consent and fiscal responsibility? The answer, unsatisfying but honest, is probably both. He was capable of brilliance and disaster, vision and blindness, genuine public service and selfish ambition. He built monuments that serve millions while imposing costs that hurt millions. He championed progressive values while governing with autocratic certainty. Perhaps the most fitting legacy is the one he didn't intend, a reminder that even the wealthiest, most ambitious, most accomplished leaders are deeply flawed humans, whose grand visions produce both achievement and tragedy, whose monuments outlast them while their names fade into obscurity.